All right, so one of the questions that I get a lot when I'm talking about the work that we did in Maryland, and I know, Heather, we fielded this question together on a number of different panels regionally, is the hardest part about doing a sort of taking a data-driven approach to solving problems in government is just getting started. And a lot of governments are dealing with that very question. They're sort of on the cusp of being able to do this work. So I'd love to get from all of you a little bit about how to get started. What are the things that you think are really critically important to getting your sort of data-driven approach up, running, and implemented? Heather?
I'll go ahead. I think what's most critical is the backing from your leadership. I mean, we were really lucky that we had a mayor who was, really pushed open data and, big data in general. But I think if you don't have that support from not just the mayor, but the cabinet, it's going to be very difficult to start anything. So that's key. And educating them on why it's important. They're running the city. They're not necessarily thinking about data the way us techies are.
Yeah, and I can add to that. I was on the technology transition team when Mayor Landry came in. So we got a peek under the hood of our city's IT systems. And I think what allowed us to get to where we are today is that we were really honest about where we were starting. We weren't at Gov 2.0. We weren't at Gov 1.0. We were at Gov like 0.5, 0.75.
Oh, at least you weren't on the negative side, which I've lived in the negative side.
Yeah, and so when our CIO, Alan Square, started, he inherited a mess. And I think the more technical term is it's a pathological complexity. And part of it was due to the storm, and part of it was just years of neglect and lack of modernization. So before we started innovating, we had to fix the core problems that we had. So we had to simplify the environment, we had to document what existed, we had to standardize, and then optimize and configure the tools that we already had. So we were really maximizing those, and that's where we are right now. We're innovating a little bit, but really we're doing a lot of optimization and configuring.
I think at the health department, this is about our third try of trying to work with open data. Initially back in 2005, I tried to create an HTML page and put data up there, and it didn't work. And then we had an FTP server a couple years ago, and our Department of Technology took it away. But this time, I think we got it right. And I think it's because we've been successful in forming partnerships with people who are really interested in the data and want the data. We have software like Socrata and partnerships with Code for America who are supporting this work. And I think there's a demand, which wasn't visible several years ago. And the other thing that I think that has let us be successful with our open data releases and our initiative is really educating the public about the data and how it can be used and why it's important.
Yeah, and I just want to echo a little bit of what everyone is saying, and I think leadership is so critically important. We've seen a lot of really great mayors at the conference so far, and it is the imperative, in my opinion, that you've got a leader who not only supports it, but is reinforcing the idea that that business as usual isn't going to be enough for us. And so, O'Malley was obviously a huge advocate for us, and was constantly sort of reinforcing the work that I was doing on the ground, so that when people tried to skirt the process or they tried to make decisions that weren't going to be measured and that weren't outcome driven or oriented, that he called sort of the balls and strikes on what we're doing, and I think that it really did pay us huge dividends in the state of Maryland. We do have a number of questions that are coming in over Twitter, and I want to get to one. Bert Lum from Honolulu. Hi, Bert. Thanks for joining us. Wanted to know, how do you push for data standards, and which organizations need to bless it to become a standard? And I think before I turn it over, data standards are increasingly, obviously, more and more relevant to the work that we're doing. And I think that, it behooves us all to start thinking generally about what do the data standards look like for outcome-oriented governing, whether that's data-driven government through a performance stat model, or whether that's, a scorecarding model that you're doing in your particular government. But right now, crime is defined differently. And when we started, crime was defined differently by the state than it was by the city, than it was by the counties. And then the federal government also had a different different definition of. And so I do think that this standardizing both on naming conventions and definitions and on metadata itself is incredibly important for us to be able to make outcomes. But I'd love to hear from you about what you're doing in your governments to ensure that not only are you making your data actionable internally, that capacity is built in to the way that you're describing your data, so those people who are consuming it from the outside are also aware of the standards that you're using, and they can start to build really great supportive applications to help you move the needle in your areas that you're focused on.
I can speak to that. So we, because two of the biggest issues facing New Orleans are blight and murder, and both of those have a significant component of place. And given that and the fact that really in the end all data is geospatial, we decided to start with our enterprise GIS. And that was also an area that we really needed to optimize in and modernize, because it was slowing down our abilities to track blighted properties, for example, because we might have multiple cases open for the same property and didn't know they were the same property. And so what we've done is, it's not very sexy, but we've upgraded to the newest version of Esri, and we're using their local government information model now. And when we get the data into that structure, then that allows us to configure some of their templates that can get that data out into the public very quickly. So for example, a couple of GIS viewers that are using this local government information model that we've published. One is just a sanitation viewer that tells you when your garbage pickup is. And another that's a lot more critical is the common operational picture that we use in the Emergency Operations Center that consumes 911 data, 311 data, the weather feeds, where the hospitals and the schools are, and any major events that have happened, and the integration of that into this template, where all we had to do was configure the template. There was no innovation really in place. It was just get your ducks in a row and then use the existing technology. So that's where we've been focusing our energy now, and now we're starting to innovate more with collaborations with Code for America and others.
Cyndy and Heather, do either of you?
Well, I was going to say, part of my job is to do this, data governance and standards within the city. So we're still exploring the best ways to do that. But I wanted to just talk real quick about some of the challenges with that. We have a local member of our tech community who is borderline obsessed with restaurant scores and grading systems. And he's, has this big movement. It's kind of a startup on around that. And he contacts me a lot about it. But Baltimore doesn't actually give grades to restaurants like New York. I mean, you go to New York, you see the A, you see the B in the window. We don't do that. Like, we send inspectors out, and you have so many violations, and you fail, and you're closed, or you're fined, but there is no grading system. So it's very difficult to standardize across the board when cities do things so differently. So part of that, I think, is going to end up going back into our operations. How are we doing things, and why are we doing things so differently than all the other cities? And sometimes the answer is, well, maybe then we're doing them wrong.
And data standards are the place where you can scale best practices. I think that's what we saw with Lives. That's what we're seeing with NEAMS. That's what we're seeing with a lot of the other standards that are being brought to bear. And I think that that's a conversation that governments, particularly at the local level, need to have, because I think there are things that there are strengths. And I know that when I was in government, we were really happy to come in second at everything, right? Because we wanted someone else to test it and absorb the risk, and then we could implement and scale. But there was really no platform for being able to share those best practices, and I think oftentimes standards are the way to do that. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that one, Cyndy?
Sure. Over the last year, I have worked on several data standards, and just to speak to what you said, that your data is so different, everyone's data is different. What I've seen is we've created this standard, and then we have to take all these very disparate data sets and try to merge them together. But what I found is there's commonalities. We all go, there's a restaurant, there's a location, there's an inspection, and there's a result. And so we have to make these data standards flexible enough that people are willing to participate, but strong enough that they're meaningful and that people can understand and analyze the data. And I think, having these types of standards scaled nationwide is really important, because although we do a lot of policy on the city level, there is also policy that's made on the state and federal level. And being able to have data that kind of crosses city levels and across the state, and then we can do more analysis to understand the impact of it, I think is going to be really important in the future.
Great. So we're getting another question in from Twitter. This one's from Jess. And Jess wants to know, how do you incentivize city department agency staff to understand the value and potential of data? So, I think a lot of what we did in Baltimore and in the state, was sort of vividly depicted in some wildly dramatized scenes in The Wire. And, it wasn't all stick. We used a lot of carrot. And I would like to hear from you, sort of how are you incentivizing not only to get people to contribute data to your organization and to contribute data to your process, but also to start thinking internally in those agencies, how can they improve their business processes by using data and using the approaches that we know are working in other areas. So.
Well, I'd love to answer that, because in the position I've had, it has been the carrot. So when I first initially, like I said, I started and I was, bright-eyed and, oh, this is going to be so easy. And I went to agencies and I asked them for data, and it wasn't that they didn't want to give it or they were scared of it. They just didn't understand why. Like, what's the point? That's boring. Like, who cares about this? And it's not their first priority. So I was really struggling with that. Oh, but the public wants it. Well, okay, that's great, and we'll get it to you when we can. But, they didn't really have their heads wrapped around, what's the point? So what I did was I kind of switched the conversation, and because I realized quickly that the open data, me getting data, would also allow me to start data warehousing the city's data. So I would go to them and I'd say, you know what, you should give me this. You should give me this data. And oh, by the way, housing has given me this data that's probably useful to you. And that's when they got excited. They go, oh, you mean I'll have access to that data too? And we would really use that? And I'm like, yeah, but it was kind of like a give and take. Well, if you give me your data, I can share with you this housing data. And once they understood that it was going to be this collection of data and that they were going to get a lot of use out of it, they got very excited and actually have started to reach out to me saying, hey, we have this data set, I think you should, put it out, rather than me begging.
Yeah, I think one of the most disarming conversations you can have, particularly with a government leader, is that open data just doesn't mean open to the government, or open to the public rather, but it means open internally. And for the first time, a lot of people, that's got to be the first step, is that they understand that you're going to free your data so that you can make better decisions for your citizens, and so that your cities or your states are going to improve. And the value of the data is at first just letting stakeholders within government see it, and then it gets refined and gets used and it gets defined and then it gets published. And I think a lot of times governments don't see that pathway and don't see that value. And when you start to show them the value, I do think there are a lot of sort of aha moments. Did you, Cyndy, have, or do you?
I can speak to that question also. Yep. There have been two drivers of our open data sets, and one is the performance management program that we have, the STAT meetings. And so we just follow behind them and sort of scoop up the data as those data supply chains really start to solidify, and the data is, aerated in public once a month for each of those STAT meetings. So that's the first source. And then the second source is that we've been billing this as a real time saver because of public records requests. So when a department keeps getting a request for example, alcohol permits, after the third request, I'll go to them and say, hey, why don't we just pull that once a month and publish it on data.nola.gov, and then you won't have to deal with this anymore.
I think in San Francisco, this has been a little bit of a struggle, specifically in my position where I'm a city agency and I'm trying to get other city agencies to give me data. My strategy has been to kill them with kindness. I've been be persistent, and also try to share your successes with them to show the value of the data.
Yep, so we're getting another question in from Twitter. Sorry, we had questions prepared, but now we're going to Twitter, so there may be a coup at a certain point during this conversation. But Chris is asking, where do you think the next places the panel sees data standards needing to be defined besides crime? So outside of crime, I think that, the way that crime is defined right now, I know most cities and most states are using UCR as sort of the basic definition of crime. But UCR data is flawed. It's on a lag. It's a real difficult animal to get your head around. And I think that there are some really ripe, low-hanging fruit areas where we could think about really creatively thinking about standards in a new way. And I wanted to hear from you. Where do you think standards, the conversation should migrate to? And where do you think we're going to get the best bang for the buck?
We were just dealing with this we were looking at the ICMA metrics, and in particular for our website, and realizing that we were comparing apples to oranges with this whole concept of hits. And so going back to the concept of show me your stats, I think if we get a little meta about this, and let's standardize the way that we evaluate our apps and our websites and our electronic tools for engaging the public. And then we can get a gauge for, like, was that really good engagement, or was it pretty mediocre or not effective at all?
Yeah. So we have totally run out of time. And so I just want to make sure that there isn't any, does anyone have anything burning that they wanted to get out, or no? All right. Well, I just want to thank you guys. You guys were awesome. And again, it was a great panel, and thanks for having us. And yeah.